The letter arrived on a Tuesday evening in the third week of October, which was, in every other respect, an ordinary Tuesday evening. I was at the kitchen table when my mother brought it in. She had already opened it. I could see where the envelope had been separated, carefully, with the letter opener she kept in the drawer by the sink, the one that had been my father's. She set it in front of me and sat down across the table and put her hands in her lap and looked at the wall. That was how I knew it was bad. My mother looked at walls when she didn't know what to do with her face. She had been doing it more frequently over the past 3 years, and I had become, in those 3 years, expert at reading the quality of the wall looking. This one was the worst kind, not grief, not fear, but the specific expression of a person who has made a decision they cannot undo and are waiting to find out if they will be forgiven for it. I read the letter. I read it again. My name is Teal Vance. I was 19 years old, the youngest child of a family that had been quietly coming apart since my father's business failed when I was 16. I had been managing our household since shortly after that, the bills, the creditors, the specific administrative labor of keeping a life functional when the resources for doing so were insufficient. I was good at it. I had become good at it the way you become good at things when the alternative to competence is catastrophe. The letter was from our family's legal representative. It was thorough and precise, and said, in the careful language of people whose job it is to deliver unbearable information without appearing to, the following. The Harwick debt had been resolved. The family home was secure. The outstanding balance against my father's failed accounts had been cleared in full. And in exchange, I would marry the Hale triplets in 21 days. I set the letter down. Is the house safe? I asked. Yes, my mother said to the wall. The debt is fully cleared? Yes. Is there a way out of this? She looked at me then. Her eyes were very bright. No, she said. I'm sorry. I tried to find one. I nodded. I picked up the letter and read it a third time, because reading things 3 times was how I handled information that was large. By the third reading, I had extracted everything I needed to know. The Hale Group had cleared the debt through a legal acquisition of the Harwick contract. The arrangement was filed under the city's Omega Contract Registry, and it was, in every procedural sense, complete. I put the letter back in the envelope. I'm going to go to my room, I said. I'll come back for dinner. Teal, my mother started. I looked at her. She stopped. I went to my room and sat on the edge of my bed and looked at the window. Outside, the city was doing what it did every Tuesday evening, thinning out, lights coming on, the particular sequence of sounds that meant people were going home from work. I had watched this view for 19 years and it had never resolved into anything except familiar. I sat there for a while and thought about what I knew about the Hale triplets. What I knew was not much, and was mostly the shape of what I didn't know. They ran the Hale Group, financial, legal, operations, public affairs, which was the kind of company that the city's business class spoke about the way you spoke about weather, constantly present, significantly powerful, not something you caused. The 3 brothers had been operating jointly since they were in their mid-20s. They were in their mid-30s now. None of them had ever bonded. The city had theories about why. I had always found the theories uninteresting because they were mostly about the triplets' strangeness rather than their reasons. What I had never heard anyone say, in all the years of city gossip about the Hale brothers, was that they were cruel, powerful and controlled and difficult to read. Not cruel. I noted this practically and went back to dinner. The 21 days before the wedding were the strangest of my life, which was saying something. I told 2 people. My sister Mara, who was 23, and furious in the way that people are furious when they feel helpless. She said things about financial coercion and Omega contract law that were accurate and useless, and that I let her say because she needed to say them. And my best friend Sable, who was a beta, and who had known me since we were 11, and who, when I told her, was quiet for a long time and then said, "What do you need? Tell me what you need. Not times this is terrible, not times are you okay, not times we'll figure something out. Just, what do you need?" That was why Sable was my best friend. I told her, "I need you to not make this harder by making it a tragedy." She looked at me, then she said, "Okay, I'll take my cues from you." That was the right answer. 3 days before the wedding, a package arrived. Clothes formal, the right size, no note. I held the jacket up and checked the seams, which were precise. and the cut, which was correct for my height and build in a way that required measurement. Someone had measured me without my knowledge, or had access to records that allowed them to measure me without my knowledge, and had sent clothes that fit. I was not certain how to feel about this. I noted it and moved on. The wedding itself was civic and formal, held in one of the city's registration halls with the particular aesthetic of rooms designed to be legally significant rather than beautiful. 200 guests, the city's business and social world, all present to observe what they all understood to be a transaction. I wore the clothes that had arrived. They fit correctly. I stood beside 3 men I had met exactly once before, at the contract signing 2 weeks earlier, and I answered the required words in a clear and steady voice. The 3 of them, in person, were not what I had constructed from secondhand information. Rokas was the eldest. I knew this because he stood slightly ahead of the other 2 in a way that was not aggressive but habitual, the positioning of someone who has spent a long time being first. He was dark-suited, controlled, with gray eyes that registered everything. He had the quality of a document that had been drafted and revised many times, precise, without obvious seams. Kester stood to his left and was the largest of the 3, broader through the chest, a physical stillness that was different from Rokas's stillness. Rokas was still in the way of someone managing their presentation. Kester was still in the way of someone who was simply at rest, who took up the space available to him without apology and without performance. Brandon stood on the other side and was the one I found immediately most difficult to read, which made him the most interesting. He had a warmth that was not performed. I had encountered performed warmth often enough to know the difference. The slightly elevated volume, the strategic eye contact, the laugh that arrived on schedule. His was not that. His was the real thing, which meant it was also less predictable, and less predictable was harder to manage. At the reception, when most guests were on their second drink and the formal machinery of the event had relaxed slightly, Rokas came to stand beside me. He held out an envelope. "This is yours," he said. "Open it when you're ready." He said nothing else and moved away. I looked at the envelope. It was sealed, my name on the front in handwriting I hadn't seen before, neat, precise, the handwriting of someone who wrote by hand regularly. I put it in my jacket's interior pocket and kept it there for the rest of the reception. That night, in the room they had given me, which was larger than my entire childhood bedroom, which had a window that faced east and would catch the morning light, which had been prepared with the specific thoroughness of people who had thought about what a person needed rather than what an occasion required, I sat on the edge of the bed and opened the envelope. 3 documents. I read the first one. I read it again. I turned it over, checked the back, turned it over again. The deed to my family's home. Fully paid. Transferred to my mother's name. My mother's name. Not mine, not the arrangements, not the Hale groups. Hers. Irrevocably. I set it down. I picked up the second document. A trust. My name, independently managed. The specific financial and legal language of something that could not be dissolved or accessed by any party to any arrangement I was party to. A number I read once, and then looked away from, and then looked back at. Mine. Only mine. I set it down. I picked up the third document. It was handwritten. 1 page. The same handwriting as the envelope. Teal. If you are reading this, you are in a house that is not the one you grew up in, for reasons that were not your choice. We know that. We have not forgotten it, and we are not asking you to. Document 1 is your family's home. It is in your mother's name because a document in your name could be used as leverage against you. Hers cannot be touched by anything you are party to. Document 2 is yours. It cannot be taken from you. It does not belong to this arrangement or to us. You are not a contract. You are not a solution to a problem. You are not ours unless you choose to be. The door of this house opens from the inside. R, K, B. I sat with the 3 documents in my lap for a long time. The city outside the window was doing what it did. At 11 on a Wednesday night, quiet, a few lights, the distant sound of a train. I had watched cities do this for 19 years, from various windows, and it had never resolved into anything except familiar, and it still looked the same, and I still felt the same way about it. And yet something had shifted in the past 10 minutes that I did not have language for yet. I folded the documents carefully, put them back in the envelope, set the envelope on the nightstand. Then I lay down on the bed, which was larger than I was used to and softer than I was used to, and I looked at the ceiling and I went to sleep. The Hale residence was not what I had pictured. I had pictured something that expressed wealth the way powerful people sometimes expressed it through scale, through the specific grammar of spaces designed to remind you of the distance between what you had and what they had. A penthouse, or a compound, or something with security at a gate. It was a house. A large house, certainly. Old stone and dark wood in the city's quieter quarter, behind a hedgerow that had been allowed to be slightly irregular, which told me something: people who needed their environments to perform for them did not allow hedgerows to be slightly irregular. It had a garden at the back that I could see from the kitchen window, currently in the late state of autumn. It had a kitchen that was large and organized in a way that made sense, but not in the way I would have organized it. Houses had exits, houses had rooms you could be in alone, houses had the particular logic of places where people actually lived rather than places where people performed living. I noted this as a positive and began learning the space. The triplets, in the first days, gave me room. Not performatively, they didn't make a thing of it, didn't say times were giving you space, times in the tone of people waiting to be thanked. They simply didn't crowd. Rokas worked in the study most mornings, door open, visible but not present in the common spaces until midday. Kester left the house before 6 and returned around 7 in the evening, moving through the kitchen to make whatever he was making for dinner with the focused economy of someone who had done the same thing many times. Brandon worked strange hours, sometimes present at 9 in the morning, sometimes not until afternoon, and had the specific quality of arriving in rooms I was already in without appearing to follow me there. I watched all three of them with the systematic attention I applied to everything. Rokas took his coffee at 6:15 from the kitchen before retreating to the study. He drank it black and read a physical newspaper, which no one did anymore, working through it in a specific order: front section, business, city, back. He annotated sometimes with the pen he kept in his breast pocket. When he encountered something he disagreed with, he made a small sound, not quite a word, that I learned to identify as his version of times incorrect. Kester ran every morning, 8 kilometers, I established from the route I could trace on the map I had made of the surrounding neighborhood in my head. He came back quieter and more manageable than he left the run, metabolized something that would otherwise sit in him. And the difference between pre-run Kester and post-run Kester was the difference between a room with the pressure slightly too high and a room in which the pressure had equalized. He made dinner on the evenings he was home first. He cooked without recipes and without consultation, which meant he had internalized everything and trusted his own judgment, which told me something about how he moved through the world generally. Brandon talked when he was comfortable and went entirely silent when he wasn't. The silence was not hostile. I had encountered hostile silences and knew their texture. His was honest. It had the quality of someone who had decided that performing composure was more effort than it was worth, and had stopped doing it, and whose default state was therefore visible in a way that required more trust than most people were willing to extend. I found this interesting. I found him interesting in a way I was not yet ready to examine. On day 4, after dinner, I went to my room and took the envelope from the nightstand and read all 3 documents again. I was looking for something I might have misread the first time, some clause, some condition, some mechanism by which the apparent generosity resolved into constraint. There was nothing. I folded the documents back, put the envelope in the drawer of the nightstand, where it would be accessible but not visible. On day 8, I reorganized the kitchen. This was not an act of aggression or complaint. The existing organization was not wrong, it was functional. But it was organized by a logic that prioritized visual order over use frequency, which was the logic of someone who had organized it for how it looked rather than how it was lived in. I reorganized it by the latter principle. The things used most often at the most accessible height, the things used rarely at the back and the top, the workflow of the stove to counter to table movement unobstructed. I did it on a Tuesday morning when all 3 of them were out, and I was done by noon, and I made a note in my head that if it was unwelcome, I would restore the original arrangement without comment. Kester came home at 7. He walked into the kitchen and stopped. He looked at the counter. He looked at the cabinet that was now differently arranged. He opened the cabinet, looked at the organization, closed it. He stood in the middle of the kitchen for a moment. Then he said, "That's better." He started making dinner. I was at the table with a book. and I watched him use the new arrangement and navigate the kitchen with the absence of friction that good organization produced, and I noted, Kester notices when things work. He does not require things to be explained to him, he simply adjusts. Filed. On day 12, Brandon was in the living room when I came through. He was on the couch with his laptop, the specific posture of someone who had been working for several hours and had achieved a kind of settled focus. He looked up when I came in, but didn't perform looking up, just registered my presence and returned to his screen, which meant he was comfortable and not requiring anything. I sat in the chair by the window. I said, "The third document. Who wrote it?" He looked up properly now. He had the expression of someone who had been expecting a question and was deciding which version of the answer to give. "All three of us," he said. "We argued about the wording for 2 days." I looked at him. "What did you argue about?" Rokas wanted it to be legally precise. He wanted to specify what times choose times meant, what times door times meant, what the conditions were. Brandon set his laptop down. Kester wanted it shorter. He said 2 sentences was enough. He was probably right, actually. "And you?" "I wanted it to say the thing," he said. "The actual thing, not a version of it designed to be defensible." I looked at my hands. I thought about the handwritten page. The specific directness of it, not legally precise, not 2 sentences, but the actual thing. "It said the thing," I said. Brandon's expression changed in the way that Brandon's expressions changed openly, without the management that Rokas supplied to his face or the containment that Kester applied to his. Something warm moved through it. "Good," he said. I looked out the window at the autumn garden. There was a quality to the silence after that which was different from the silences of the previous 12 days. Not uncomfortable, something else. Something that had the texture of a question being asked and not yet answered. I went back to my book. Brandon went back to his laptop. The room held us both without requiring anything of either of us, and I filed that, too, in the growing document of what this place was becoming. The suppressants had been a consistent variable since I was 17. I had started the high-grade formula in the year after my father's business failed, for practical reasons, presenting as visibly omega in circumstances where I was regularly negotiating with creditors, managing conversations that required authority I technically didn't have, operating in professional spaces that didn't extend that authority willingly to omegas. It was simpler to manage my scent than to manage everything else. The formula was strong. It made my scent almost undetectable in ordinary circumstances. In the house, I maintained the formula consistently. Morning application, standard monitoring, patch replacement on the correct schedule. Week 3, on a Wednesday evening, my mother called. She called to tell me that she had gone to the house that day. She had let herself in with the key and walked through every room and sat in the kitchen for a while. She had looked at the deed, the framed copy that I had asked my sister to help her hang in the hallway, and she had sat in the kitchen for a long time. "I'm sorry," she said. "I know you didn't choose this." "I know you didn't either," I said. "I know that doesn't help." "It helps some," I said. There was a pause. She said, "The kitchen smells like you. I left the window open for an hour and it still smelled like you." I held the phone and did not say anything for a moment. "Good," I said finally. "I mean that. That's good." She made a sound that was either a laugh or something close to it. We talked for a while. Not about the arrangement, not about the Hales, just about the house, the radiator in the back bedroom that had finally been fixed, the state of the garden in autumn, the way the neighborhood sounded in the evening. Ordinary things. The kind of conversation I had with my mother in the kitchen on an ordinary night before everything changed. When I hung up, I sat in the chair by the window in my room. The call had lasted 40 minutes. During those 40 minutes, I had not thought once about the patch on my wrist. I had not thought about the formula, or the schedule, or the monitoring. I had simply sat in my room and talked to my mother and felt the specific quality of relief that comes when something that has been held for a long time is finally allowed to exist without management. By the time I noticed, the patch had been under-maintained by about an hour. My scent rain on warm stone, faint, under normal circumstances was present in the room. Faint, but present. Real. I replaced the patch. It would be fully effective within 20 minutes. I sat in my room and listened to the house. I did not hear anything. The house was quiet, with the evening quiet of 3 people who were present but not loud. which was the consistent quality of this house, and I had come to find it. I noted this carefully, the way I noted things that surprised me about my own reactions restful. I went to bed. In the morning, nothing was said. Rokas made coffee at 6:15 and read his newspaper. Kester left for his run. Brandon appeared at 9 with his laptop and settled into the living room. But there was something in the quality of the air that was different, and I could not put a name to it, and I filed it under Times, returned to this Times, and moved on with the day. Week 3, a Thursday afternoon. I found Rokas in the study after lunch, door open, which meant available, which I had established was his system. He had a precision about his availability. Door open meant approachable. Door closed meant not unless necessary. I respected the system because I had similar systems and found them efficient. I knocked on the frame anyway. He looked up. "I have a question," I said, "about document 1. He set down his pen. "Sit down." I sat in the chair across from his desk, which was a working desk rather than a status desk, covered in actual papers and annotated documents rather than maintained as a surface. I noted this without surprise. Rokas was not a person who performed his importance. "The deed," I said. "You put it in my mother's name, not mine." "Yes." "Why not mine?" He was quiet for a moment. Not because he didn't have an answer. I had come to understand that Rokas's pauses were processing pauses, not avoidance pauses, but because he was choosing the right one. "A document in your name," he said, "could be used as leverage against you. If you were ever in a position where someone wanted to apply pressure through your family, a property in your name is a mechanism for doing that. A property in your mother's name, transferred irrevocably, is not connected to any arrangement you're party to. It cannot be touched." I looked at him. "You thought about that before I arrived." "We had 3 weeks," he said. "I spent most of them on that document." I sat with this for a moment. Most of 3 weeks. On a document designed to ensure that someone he had not yet met would not be made vulnerable through the people she loved. "Why?" I said. He met my eyes. "Because the only version of this that was acceptable to me was one in which you were genuinely free to leave. And free to leave means free in every direction, including the direction of your family. If your mother's home was contingent on your staying, you were not free to leave, so it could not be contingent." I thought about the handwritten page. "The door of this house opens from the inside." "You built the door before I arrived," I said. He looked at me steadily. "Yes." I looked at the desk, the papers, the pen he had set down when I came in. The specific orderliness of a space that was organized by use rather than appearance. I recognized that I had made the same choice in the kitchen. I said, "Tell me about the contract. How it happened, why you took it." He was quiet for a moment, a longer pause this time. "The Harwick family," he said, "had a debt claim against your father's accounts that they had been managing in a specific way, not collecting, but maintaining and accruing interest, which is a method of keeping a family in a position of obligation without resolving it. When they moved to call it in, their proposed arrangement involved an omega from the Vance family being contracted to a Harwick heir. The Harwick heir in question was someone I had encountered professionally." He said this carefully, without elaboration, and I understood from the carefulness that the elaboration would not be flattering to the Harwick heir. "We became aware of the situation through our legal division," he said. "We had the capacity to clear the debt. We made the decision to do so." I looked at him. "That's the professional version." He was quiet for a moment. "Yes." "Tell me the other version." He looked at his desk. "Brandon," he said, "had seen you at an event 6 months before this arrangement. He told Kester and me about it that evening." He paused. "He said he'd seen someone at the Alderton function who carried themselves like someone who had been managing something hard for a long time and had gotten very good at not showing it. He said there was something in the way you moved through that room that he'd been thinking about for the rest of the night." I processed this. "Kester and I told him he was projecting," Rokas continued. "Was he?" Rokas looked at me. "No." I looked at the window. The autumn garden was gray and almost bare, the last of the leaves moving in the wind. "When the Harwick situation came to our attention," Rokas said, "I pulled the file, your family's financial records, the account history, the debt timeline." He paused. Someone had been managing that situation very carefully for 3 years, deferring the right creditors, paying the ones who would escalate first, keeping the accounts from defaulting through a series of decisions that required understanding things about debt management that most adults twice your age don't understand. He looked at me. You were 16 when that started. I said nothing. I made the decision to acquire the contract, he said. It was a financial and strategic decision. That's true. He paused. It was also not entirely that. I sat in the chair and looked at him and thought about the 3 weeks he had spent on a document designed to make sure I was free. About Brandon, 6 months ago, in a room full of people, watching someone move and thinking about it for the rest of the night. About Kester in my family's doorway, which I had not yet heard about but which I was about to. Thank you for telling me, I said. He picked up his pen. He set it down again. Then he said, very carefully, I want you to know that I am aware of the difference between what I planned and what this has become. Those are not the same thing. I don't want you to think I'm confused about that. I looked at him. Are you confused about it? I asked. No, he said. I'm not confused. I'm aware. There's a difference. I nodded. I stood up to leave. At the door, I stopped. The kitchen organization, I said. Kester said times that's better times and used the new system immediately. Rokas looked up. Did you find it? I said. Or did you just use it? A pause. I found it on day 9, he said. I was going to say something and then I thought it was correct. Functionally correct. There was no reason to say anything. I looked at him. Most people would have said something anyway, I said, about it being changed without asking. He looked back at me steadily. Most people would not have had a good reason to say anything. Commenting on a correct decision because you didn't make it isn't a good reason. I went back to my room and sat down and thought about that for a while. Brandon told me about Kester. It happened on a Friday evening. The 3 of us Rokas was at a meeting, running late. Brandon and I had made dinner together, which had happened by proximity rather than plan, and Kester had come home mid-preparation and joined without discussion. And we had eaten at the kitchen table with the easy quiet of people who had been doing this long enough to not require conversation to fill it. After dinner, Kester went to the living room. Brandon and I were in the kitchen, cleaning up. I washed, he dried, which was a division of labor that had established itself without discussion and that I had noted was probably a division that had existed in this house before I arrived. He said, Did you know Kester was at your house before any of this? I looked at him. What do you mean? He said, about 3 weeks before the contract was finalized, the Harwick collectors had been to your family's apartment twice. The third time, Kester was in the neighborhood. He had a site meeting 2 blocks away and he drove past and saw them outside your building. I held a glass under the water and didn't say anything. He went and stood in the doorway, Brandon said. He didn't say anything to them. He just stood there until they left. I turned off the tap. I stood at the sink for a moment. He didn't tell us for 2 weeks, Brandon said. He mentioned it in passing, actually. He said something about driving past your building, and I asked him why he'd been in that neighborhood, and the Harwick collector story came out. He looked at the glass he was drying. I said, I knew it. Rokas didn't say anything for a long time. I said, why didn't Kester tell you? Brandon was quiet for a moment. Because he didn't think it was important, I think. He did it because it was in front of him to do, and he did it, and it didn't occur to him to report it. He paused. That's very Kester. I thought about this. I thought about a man in a doorway saying nothing, being nothing except present, existing in the space until the people who needed to leave left. Not a declaration, not a strategy. Just, I am here and I am not moving. I said, I heard about it from you, not from him. I know, Brandon said. He won't bring it up. He doesn't operate that way. I'll bring it up, I said. Brandon looked at me. Good, he said. The scent incident from week 3 was not discussed until week 4, on a Sunday morning, when I brought it up myself. I found Kester in the garden. He went out there sometimes on his days off, not to work in it, but to stand in it, which was Kester's version of the study time that Rokas took inside and the processing time that Brandon took through movement. He stood at the back of the garden near the bare rose hedge and held his coffee and looked at the city over the rooftops. I went out and stood beside him. He looked at me, then back at the city. Week 3, I said, Wednesday evening. My suppressant slipped for about an hour. I know you noticed. He was quiet. I wanted you to know I wasn't testing anything or making a statement. I was on the phone with my mother and I forgot the patch replacement. He looked at his coffee. I know, he said. It didn't read as intentional. But you noticed. Yes. And Rokas and Brandon. Yes. I said, I wanted to name it because not naming it seemed like the wrong choice. The thing happened and you all processed it without saying anything to me about it, and I think you did that correctly. It wasn't something that needed to be made into a conversation, but I want you to know that I'm aware it happened, and I'm not pretending otherwise. He turned to look at me properly. His expression was the open, unmanaged expression he had when something had reached him without permission. All right, he said. I looked at the garden. The rose hedge was the kind of bare that promised something, the architecture of the plant still there, the structure waiting for spring. I have a question, I said. He waited. You were at my family's building, I said, the third time the Harwick collectors came. He was very still. You stood in the doorway until they left. Yes. Why didn't you tell me? He looked at the rose hedge for a moment. Then he said, It didn't seem like something that belonged to me. I was there. I did what was in front of me to do. Telling you about it felt like he paused, finding the right words, which Kester found slowly but accurately, like asking for something in return for it. I looked at him. You weren't asking for anything. No. Then why wouldn't you tell me? He looked at me. Because I didn't want you to feel like you owed me something for a thing you didn't ask for and that I would have done for anyone in front of me in that moment. I stood in the garden with the bare rose hedge and the city over the rooftops and the late autumn light, and I thought about that. You would have done it for anyone, I said. But you drove past my building specifically. He looked at the city. I'd been past that building before, he said. After Brandon mentioned you at the Alderton function. Not he stopped. I drove past a few times. That's all. He said it flatly, without apology, without performance. Just a fact being set down. I looked at him for a long time. Thank you, I said, for being there. He nodded once. We stood in the garden for a while and looked at the city together. The quality of the evenings changed in week 4. Not dramatically, not in any way that was specifically nameable. But the house felt different at 6 o'clock than it had in week 1, fuller. Not in the sense of crowded, but in the sense of occupied by people who were no longer moving around each other but were beginning to move with each other. The small adjustments of 4 people learning a shared space. Rokas had started leaving his study door open more often. Not always, he still closed it when he needed concentration, but in the evenings, when the work was done, the door was open. I had taken to going in sometimes, not with questions, but with a book. I sat in the chair by the window and read while he worked at the desk, and neither of us required the other to explain it. Brandon had found out that I did the crossword every morning. I had a physical notebook, crosswords cut from newspapers, a habit I had kept since I was 15 because it was cheap and portable and required nothing except a pen. He had started leaving the city, paper folded to the crossword on the kitchen counter before I woke up. He didn't mention it. I didn't mention it. It was there every morning. Kester had started running a slightly different route, one that passed the Better Bakery on the south side of the neighborhood, and had begun coming back with one item from said bakery 2 or 3 times a week. He placed it on the counter without comment. He did not specifically place it for me. He did not specifically place it for anyone. It existed on the counter and was available to whoever wanted it, which was an extremely Kester way of doing something kind. I was aware of all 3 of these things. I was aware that I had stopped thinking of the house as temporary. I was aware that I had stopped thinking of the arrangement as something to be endured. I noted both of these things and put them in the document marked Times Returned to This Times and went back to the crossword. The call from Sable came on a Thursday morning in the 5th week. I was in the study with Roka's door open, my chair by the window, the crossword finished and set aside, a book open in my lap that I was not reading because I was thinking about something else and using the book as cover for the thinking. Rokas was at his desk doing something with a contract that required periodic quiet expressions of disagreement with the document's contents. My phone lit up. Sable. I went to the kitchen to take it. She said, I heard something this morning about the Harwick family, about your arrangement. I set down my coffee. Tell me. She had a contact at one of the city's legal publications. She worked in media, Sable, which meant she had contacts at everything useful. The contact had mentioned that the Harwick family was preparing a procedural challenge to the Vance contract acquisition. The argument, as her contact understood it, was that the Hale Group's acquisition of the debt and the resulting arrangement had been conducted outside proper Omega contract registration channels. If the challenge succeeded, the arrangement would be invalidated. The Vance debt and the contract would revert to Harwick jurisdiction. How long have they been preparing this? I asked. Her contact didn't know exactly. A few weeks, at least. I said, "Thank you. I'll call you later." I stood in the kitchen after I hung up, the kitchen that I had reorganized in week 2, the counter where the crossword arrived every morning. The bakery item, currently a small apricot pastry, sitting at the corner of the counter in the way that Kester left things available to whoever wanted it, no comment required. I thought about a few weeks. I thought about Rokas in the study with his contracts and his annotated newspapers and his careful, precise explanations of why he'd done everything he'd done. I went back to the study. I said, "I'd like to talk about the Harwick challenge." He looked up. His expression did not change. This was the expression of someone receiving information that was not new to him. He had known. I sat down in my chair and looked at him. He had known, and he had been managing it, and he had not told me. "How long?" I said. He set down his pen. "About 10 days. I looked at the window. The garden was visible from here, bare and patient, waiting. "You were managing it," I said. "Yes. You were managing me." A pause. "I was protecting you from something that wasn't resolved. I didn't want to." I looked at him. "Those aren't the same thing." He was quiet. I said, "I have been managing things without complete information my entire adult life because the people who had the complete information made decisions about what I needed to know. I have been managing a collapsing household debt situation since I was 16 because nobody told me how bad it was until it was already critical. I am very good at managing things without complete information. I should not have to do that here." He looked at me steadily. I said, "You built me a door. You told me the door opened from the inside. You cannot build a door and then manage what I know so that I can't find it." He was very still. Then he said, "You're right. I'm sorry." He said it directly and without qualification, which was how Rokas said difficult things without the hedging that most people use to soften their own discomfort while apologizing. Just, "You're right. I'm sorry." I sat in my chair and looked at him. "Tell me everything," I said. He told me everything. The challenge had been filed 12 days ago. The Harwick legal team was arguing on 2 procedural grounds. First, that the debt acquisition had been rushed through registration in a way that bypassed standard Omega contract review, which was technically accurate because it had been, because they needed to move faster than standard review timelines. Second, that the Omega in question had not been given the legally mandated 48-hour independent consultation period before the contract was finalized, which was also technically accurate because the 48 hours had been given, but the independent consultation had been with a Vance family representative rather than an externally appointed one. Both arguments were procedural, both had merit. Together they were enough to require a hearing. The hearing would require the arrangement terms to be disclosed in full, he said. Every document, all 3. I looked at him. "The envelope," I said. "Yes." "Read into a public record." "Yes." He looked at me with the gray eyes that registered everything. I could see him calculating not manipulatively, that was not how Rokas calculated, but genuinely, running through consequences and outcomes and what each one cost. I said, "When is the hearing?" 3 weeks from Friday. I said, "I want to be there." He said, "Of course." Then, after a pause, "I should have told you 10 days ago. I was wrong not to." I looked at the desk, the pen he had set down, the document he had been reviewing when I came in. I said, "The challenge, if it succeeds, what happens to document 2? The trust." His expression shifted slightly. "Nothing. The trust is independent of the arrangement. It exists in your name regardless of the arrangement's status. And document 1? Also independent," he said. "Your mother's home is not contingent on the arrangement. It was never contingent on the arrangement. That's why we structured it that way." I looked at him for a long moment. "You thought about this," I said, "before the challenge existed. You structured everything so that if someone tried to use the arrangement to take things away from me, there would be nothing to take." He met my eyes. "Yes." I sat with that. Then I said, "Thank you for telling me the rest of it now." He picked up his pen. He set it down again. He said, very carefully, I don't want you to be protected from things without your knowledge. I understand why that was wrong. I'll tell you when things happen, even when they're not resolved. All right, I said. I went back to my chair by the window and picked up my book and did not read it, and the room was quiet, and Rokas went back to his document, and outside the garden was gray and bare and entirely patient. That evening I told Kester and Brandon, not because it was a secret from them, it wasn't, they were aware of the challenge, but because I wanted them to hear it from me, that I knew, that I had spoken to Rokas about it, that I was going to the hearing. Kester, who was making dinner, turned from the stove and looked at me. He said, "Good." That was all. Good. Then he turned back to the stove. Brandon was on the couch and had been watching me since I came into the room with the expression he had when he was reading something in me. He said, "How are you?" "I'm not sure yet," I said. "I'll know more after the hearing." He nodded. He didn't push. He said, "Do you want company tonight or space?" I thought about this. I thought about the difference between the two, which I had come to understand better in 5 weeks than I had in the previous 19 years, because I had not previously been in a space where the distinction was offered rather than assumed. "Company," I said. "I don't want to be alone with it tonight." Brandon moved over on the couch. I sat beside him. We watched something on the television that I did not pay attention to, and Kester brought dinner to the coffee table when it was ready, and Rokas appeared at some point and took the armchair without comment. And the four of us sat in the living room with the lights on and the evening outside, and nobody said anything particularly important, and I was not alone with it. I noted this as the specific good thing it was. In the days before the hearing, something changed in the house that I did not have immediate language for. It was not tension. The house had a quality that was the opposite of tension, a deliberate steadiness. The quality of people who were not pretending nothing was happening, but who had decided that what was happening was manageable and were behaving accordingly. Rokas worked longer hours, which I knew from the study light still visible under the door at midnight. But he continued to leave the door open in the evenings until late, and continued to have his coffee at 6:15 and his newspaper in its specific order, and none of his routines collapsed under the pressure of the work. He was made for this, I understood, not for the content of the crisis, but for the shape of it, the sustained, methodical pressure of a problem that required long thinking. Kester ran an extra kilometer every morning. I tracked the timing. He came back with more of the steadiness he ran to achieve. Brandon was quieter than usual, which was his honest tell, but quiet Brandon still left the crossword, still appeared in rooms I was in, still looked at me with the specific attention of someone who had decided that paying attention was the right thing to do and was doing it consistently. On the Wednesday before the hearing, I found Brandon in the kitchen at midnight. He was making tea, which he only did when he wasn't sleeping well. He looked up when I came in and didn't perform surprise. I made my own tea and sat at the table. He sat across from me. I said, "Can I ask you something?" He said, "Yes." I said, "The Alderton function, 6 months ago. What was it specifically that you noticed?" He held his mug. He was quiet for a moment, not avoiding, just finding the accurate version. "You were talking to someone," he said. "A business associate of some kind." The conversation looked professional. "And whoever it was said something, I don't know what, and your expression didn't change at all. Your face was completely level. But your posture shifted just slightly, just your weight moving back a fraction. Like you'd received something and were deciding what to do with it before you showed anything." He looked at his tea. "I've been in a lot of rooms," he said. "A lot of social and professional situations where people are managing how they appear. I know what performed composure looks like. That wasn't performed. That was," he paused, "someone who had learned to be very contained, because containment was necessary, not because it was chosen." He looked at me. "And then I watched you for the rest of the evening," he said. "The way you moved through the room, the way you tracked where the exits were without appearing to, the way you assessed people very quickly and accurately and then decided exactly how much of yourself to show." He paused. "I came home and told my brothers I'd seen someone who was doing something very hard and making it look like nothing. I held my mug. I said, 'And then you found out about the debt situation?' 'Yes.' 'And you told Rokas?' 'Yes.' And he pulled the file. Brandon nodded. I said, 'Did you know that he was going to take the contract when he looked at it?' He was quiet for a moment. I thought it was possible, he said. I thought I knew Rokas would see the same thing I saw. The 3 years of someone managing something beyond their years. He paused. I also knew that the Harwick heir was not a person I was willing to see you contracted to. He said it simply, without drama. I looked at him across the kitchen table at midnight. I said, "You advocated for this, without knowing me." He met my eyes. I saw enough. I thought about the 6 months between the Alderton function and the contract signing. About Brandon coming home from an evening and telling his brothers about someone he'd watched move through a room. About Rokus, weeks later, looking at financial records and seeing 3 years of quiet, extraordinary competence in the accounts of a 19-year-old. About Kester, driving past a building 2 blocks from a site meeting. About 3 men, separately and together, having already decided something before I arrived. I said, the handwritten page. You are not ours unless you choose to be. Who decided to include that line? Brandon looked at his mug. We argued about it for 2 days. Rokas wanted to omit it not because he disagreed with it, but because he thought it was too direct, that it would seem presumptuous. Kester thought it was necessary, but should be shorter. He said Times you are free to leave Times and was done with it. And you? I thought the whole thing needed to be said, not implied, not left to interpretation. He looked up. People who have been managed their whole lives learn to read implications as threats. I didn't want there to be any ambiguity about what we were offering. I looked at him for a long moment. You were right, I said. He exhaled slightly. Good, he said, because Rokas was very convincing about omitting it, and I held the line for 2 days. I almost smiled. I felt it at the corner of my mouth. Brandon saw it. Something in his face went soft. I said, I'm going to go back to bed. Thank you for telling me that. He said, thank you for asking. I rinsed my mug and went back down the hall. At the doorway, I paused. Brandon, I said. He looked up. I said, I noticed you too, at the Alderton function. I didn't know who you were, but I noticed. He was very still. I went to bed. The hearing room was everything the city's social and legal world consisted of. Formal, wood-paneled, with the particular quality of spaces that had witnessed many important things and had absorbed none of them impassive, official, unchanged, 200 seats. Most of them occupied. I knew who some of them were. The city's business families, the social registry officials, the legal observers, the people who had attended the wedding to observe a transaction and were now here to observe what they assumed was the unraveling of one. I knew who the Harwick representatives were because they had a specific quality, the quality of people who had come expecting to win and were managing their anticipation. I sat at the table on the Hale side with Rokas on my left and Kester on my right and Brandon across from me. Rokas had a folder of documents in front of him. Kester had nothing in front of him and both hands flat on the table. Brandon was looking at me. I looked back. He gave the smallest nod. Not reassurance, acknowledgement. I see you, the nod said. I'm here. I nodded back. The judge entered. The formalities began. The Harwick legal representative stood and presented the procedural grounds for the challenge, the registration timeline, the consultation period, both arguments as Rokas had explained them to me, accurate and legitimate in their narrow scope. I listened to all of it. I had spent 3 weeks listening to everything Rokas could tell me about the legal mechanisms involved, and I had read 3 documents so many times I could reproduce them from memory. I was not going to be uninformed in this room. The Hale legal representative responded on the registration timeline with the specific documentation of how and why the accelerated process had been legally authorized. There was a provision for expedited registration in cases where an Omega's welfare was at immediate risk, and the Harwick collectors constituted that risk, and the documentation of their activities had been preserved in full. The consultation period was addressed by a filing from the independent legal advocate, who had, in fact, been present at the contract signing, and had spoken with me privately for 40 minutes about the arrangement terms, my rights, and my options, a conversation I remembered, and that had been recorded as legally required by a neutral third party. Both Harwick arguments were addressed. Not destroyed, addressed, carefully, with documentation. The challenge did not collapse immediately. It required the hearing to proceed to the arrangement terms, which was what the Harwicks had wanted all along, the disclosure, the public airing of whatever the arrangement contained. The opportunity to argue in front of 200 people that this arrangement was irregular and should be invalidated. The Hale legal representative stood. In accordance with the hearing requirements, he said, "I'll now read the arrangement terms into the record." The room settled. He read document 1, the deed, the transfer to my mother's name, the irrevocability clause, the specific legal language of a property that was not contingent on anything. The murmuring started. I could hear it, the low frequency of 200 people receiving unexpected information and recalibrating. He read document 2, the trust, the independent management clause, the amount read in full, as required, into a room that had not been expecting it. The murmuring stopped. I watched the Harwick representatives. Their lead counsel had a very good face, professionally neutral, managed. But her second had not prepared his face well enough, and what I saw in it was the specific expression of someone whose argument had just been significantly complicated. The representative cleared his throat. Document 3, he said. He read it. Not with drama, not with inflection or emphasis. In the same flat professional register he had used for the deed and the trust, the voice of a person reading a legal document because the document was required to be read. Teal, if you are reading this, you are in a house that is not the one you grew up in, for reasons that were not your choice. We know that. We have not forgotten it, and we are not asking you to. The room was very still. Document 1 is your family's home. It is in your mother's name because a document in your name could be used as leverage against you. Hers cannot be touched by anything you are party to. Document 2 is yours. It cannot be taken from you. It does not belong to this arrangement or to us. You are not a contract. You are not a solution to a problem. You are not ours unless you choose to be. The door of this house opens from the inside. R.K.B. The room went completely silent. Not the silence of people waiting for the next thing. Not the polite interim silence of a formal proceeding. Something deeper and more structural, the silence of 200 people who had come to observe an omega being transacted and had instead been read a document that did the opposite of that. I sat at the table and did not move. To my right, Kester's hand was on the table an inch from mine. Not touching, not demanding. Just present. In the way he was present, available in the specific way of someone who had decided that availability was what was needed and had enacted it without announcement. I looked at it. Then I looked at Brandon across the table. He was looking at me with the expression I had come to understand accurately, not performing calm, not managing anything, just looking at me with the complete attention of a person who had been paying attention for a long time. I looked at Rokas on my left. He was looking at the judge. The judge looked at the Harwick legal representative. You're asking me to transfer this arrangement to your family, the judge said, on the grounds of procedural error. I'd like you to explain to this court what procedural correction would improve on what I've just read. The Harwick representative opened his mouth, closed it. What document in your family's arrangement, the judge continued, establishes that the Omega Party cannot be leveraged through their family members? What trust in your arrangement is independently managed and irrevocable? The representative said nothing. The judge looked at her papers. The procedural grounds presented are technically accurate, she said. The registration was expedited and the consultation was non-standard. She paused. The expedited registration is covered by the welfare provision. The consultation documentation is complete and legally sufficient. She looked at the room. The challenge is dismissed. The Harwick representative stood. Your Honor, the procedural, is addressed, the judge said, in full. The challenge is dismissed. Outside the hearing room, the city afternoon was cold and clear, the kind of autumn light that made everything look slightly more defined than it actually was. Sable appeared from somewhere. She always appeared from somewhere. She had the quality of a person who found the right place to be and was there when you needed her. She stood beside me on the steps and looked at the city. So, she said. So, I said. She was quiet for a moment. Then, the third document. He read it into the full record. Yes. With everyone in there. Yes. She said, your mother is going to cry when I tell her. I looked at the city. Please tell her yourself. I don't think I can do it without, I stopped. Without what? Without it being a lot, I said. and I've had enough of a lot today. She linked her arm through mine. Fair enough? She paused. Are you going to tell me what you're feeling, or am I going to have to wait another week? I thought about this. I thought about document 3 read aloud into a room of 200 people who came expecting to see one thing and saw another. I thought about Kester's hand on the table, Brandon's attention, Rokus looking at the judge with the steady certainty of a man who had built something correctly and was watching it hold. I said, I don't have the vocabulary for it yet. I'm working on it. She rested her head briefly on my shoulder. Take your time, she said. I'll be here when you find it. The 2 weeks after the hearing were quiet. Not the quiet of aftermath, not the silence of something ended, the particular quiet of 4 people in a house who had been through something together and were on the other side of it and were discovering what the other side looked like. It looked, mostly, like ordinary things. Rokus at his desk, the newspaper, the coffee at 6:15, the door open in the evenings. He had started, in the weeks since I had named the problem about managing me without my knowledge, doing something differently. He flagged things. Not large things, not operational decisions about the arrangement, small things. A name in a news article that connected to the Harwick family, with a note, no action required, flagging for awareness. A change to a scheduling matter that affected the house, with a note, let me know if this doesn't work for you. Small flags. Evidence of a man learning a new habit and practicing it consistently. Kester running his extra kilometer, the bakery item appearing at the corner of the counter. He had started without announcement, without making a thing of it, coming home 10 minutes earlier on the evenings when the house had been full. Not obviously, just the timing being slightly different. I had noted it the second time and understood what it was. Brandon, who was the variable, had become slightly less variable. He still worked strange hours, but he had started texting when he was going to be home late, which he had not done in the first weeks. A single message, no preamble, late tonight, 11 or after. I had not asked for this. He had decided to do it. I had noted all 3 of these things. I had put them in the document marked Times Return to This. On a Thursday evening, 2 weeks after the hearing, I returned to it. I asked all 3 of them to sit down. Rokus came from the study. Kester came from the kitchen where he'd been cleaning up after dinner. Brandon came from the living room. They settled Rokus in the armchair, Kester on the far end of the couch, Brandon in the middle. I stood at the edge of the room for a moment. Then I sat down. I said, I've been thinking about what I want to say and how to say it correctly. I've been thinking about it for a few weeks. None of them said anything. Rokus was still. Kester's hands were on his knees. Brandon was looking at me with the full attention he gave things that mattered. I said, I came here because I had no choice. That's true, and it doesn't stop being true, just because other things also became true. I don't want to revise what happened because revisiting it is uncomfortable. The arrangement was made without my input, and I had 21 days to become someone who could manage it. That's what happened. I looked at Rokus. You built me a way out before I arrived, I said. I've been holding that for 2 months. Every time something difficult happened here, I went back to it. The deed, the trust, the 3rd document. You made sure that I was free to leave, and then you let me find out gradually, on my own schedule, that I didn't want to. He looked at me steadily. His expression was the most open I had seen it. I looked at Kester. You stood in a doorway for a woman you'd never met and asked for nothing for it, I said. You reorganized the kitchen in the same direction I'd already moved it, which you cannot explain, and you come home 10 minutes earlier on certain evenings, and you put things on the counter without asking for acknowledgement. I said, I see all of it. I want you to know that I see all of it. Kester's jaw moved slightly. Something crossed his face that was not his usual register, something that was Kester without the containment. I looked at Brandon. You saw me first, I said, at a function 6 months before any of this. I don't know what to do with that yet, but I know it matters. I know it's part of why I'm here, in this room, having this conversation, and I want you to know that I noticed you too, that night. I just didn't know your name. Brandon's mouth curved slightly. His eyes were bright. I looked at all 3 of them. I said, I'm not leaving. I want to be clear about that before anything else. I'm not staying because I have nowhere to go. You made sure I have somewhere to go. The trust, the home, the door you built. I'm staying because I'm choosing to. I'm choosing this house. I'm choosing the three of you. I looked at my hands on my knees. I said, I don't know what this looks like yet. I don't have language for three people. I've been looking for the language and I haven't found it yet. I need time to find it. I need this to be slow, because I don't move quickly toward things I care about. I've spent my life being careful, and I need to be careful about this too. I looked up, but I wanted you to know it's a choice. That the door was there and I looked at it and I'm choosing not to go through it. The room was very quiet. Brandon said, okay. Not small, not dismissive. A word landing with the weight of something decided. Kester said, okay. Lower than Brandon. Slower. Certain. Rokas opened his mouth, closed it. Then he said, okay, in a voice that was not entirely steady, which was the most unsteady I had ever heard his voice, and which I filed in a separate document that I did not label but that I intended to return to very often. We stayed in the living room for a while after that. Nobody moved to leave. Nobody said anything particularly large. Brandon eventually said something about the television, and Kester said something about the game that had been on earlier, and Rokas made a comment about a news item from his newspaper. And the conversation moved in the way that conversations moved when people were not performing normalcy, but were simply in the presence of something real and letting it be real without making it large. At some point, Kester's shoulder was against mine. I did not move away. He did not move away. His shoulder was warm and certain and present in the specific way of someone who had decided to be present and was enacting it simply by being there. Brandon's hand came to rest over mine at some point. I looked at it. He looked at it. Neither of us commented on it. It stayed. Rokas, in the armchair, looked at the three of us on the couch. His expression, the one I had been learning for 2 months, the one that was precise on the surface and something else underneath, let go of something. Slightly, not dramatically. Just the specific release of a held thing, the change in a face that has been carrying something carefully and has found somewhere to set it down. I looked at him across the room. He looked back. I said, the kitchen. Week 2. When you found the reorganization. He said, yes. I said, you said it was correct and therefore you had no reason to comment. He said, yes. I said, you're going to have to learn to comment on correct things. Not because I need you to, but because the things I do correctly are the things I care about, and I'd like you to know that I care about them. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I know how to learn things. I know, I said. I've watched you. Something in his face shifted again. The precision relaxing by one more degree. I turned back to the television. Brandon's hand was still over mine. Kester's shoulder was still warm. Outside, the city was doing what it did on Thursday evenings, and the house was doing what it had been doing, slowly, over 2 months becoming a home. The first real touch was not dramatic. It was Thursday, the week after. I was in the study, Rokas at his desk, me in my chair, and he said something about a clause in a document he was reviewing, asking my opinion, which he had started doing in the weeks since the hearing, and I said something back, and he looked up from the document to respond. And we were closer than usual because I had moved my chair slightly in the weeks since the 4th night arrangement and hadn't moved it back. He said something, I said something, and then he reached out and set 2 fingers against the back of my hand, which was resting on the armrest of the chair. Not taking, not claiming. The specific pressure of someone who has been very careful for a long time and is being careful still. He looked at his fingers on my hand, then at my face. I turned my hand over. He closed his fingers around mine. We sat like that for a while. He went back to his document. I went back to my book. Neither of us said anything about it. The study had the quality it always had, the right kind of quiet, the right kind of full. Spring arrived in the city's old quarter the way it always did, through smell before anything visual. The particular layering of wet earth and early warmth that reached the windows before the garden showed any evidence of it. I had been noticing it for 3 days. I was in the kitchen making coffee the right order, the process I had maintained every morning for 2 years without thinking about it when Kester came through from his run. He was still in the early morning state, post-run quiet, the kind of steady presence that required nothing. He poured his own coffee and stood at the counter. He looked at the window, then at me. Garden's coming back, he said. I looked out at the garden, where the bare rose hedge from autumn was showing the first tentative green. Yes, I said. He drank his coffee, I drank mine. The kitchen held us the way it had been holding us for 6 months, which was in the easy silence of people who were not required to speak, but chose sometimes to. After a while, he said, I've been thinking about the side gate. The hinge is going. I said, I noticed last week. He said, I'll fix it this weekend. I said, I know. He looked at me with the expression that was Kester without the containment, which appeared more frequently now, which I had come to understand was not a change in him, but a change in what he was willing to show. He said, How do you always know? I said, I pay attention to the things that need fixing. It's a habit. He said, very quietly, So do I. I looked at him. He looked at me. Then he leaned over and pressed his lips briefly to my temple, which was the gesture he had started using in the weeks since the couch evening brief, warm, entirely Kester, asking nothing and offering everything in the same motion. I closed my eyes for a second. Then I poured a second cup of coffee and went to leave it outside the study door, where Rokas had been since 6:15 and would be until noon, and where a coffee appearing at the door every morning had become part of the house's logic, as established and unremarkable as the newspaper. Sable came for dinner on Thursdays. She had started coming in week 6, initially for an evening, and then extending until it was simply the configuration of Thursday night's Sable at the kitchen table, Brandon making something that required more preparation than anyone had asked for, Kester eating everything in front of him with the focused appreciation of someone who considers food a serious matter, Rokas allowing himself to be drawn into conversations that had no professional application. She had looked at the house the first evening and then looked at me and said, It smells like you. I said, I know. She said, Good. She had met all 3 of them with the specific directness she applied to everything. She had told Brandon he was charming, but she was watching him. She had told Kester he was quiet, but she could tell he was paying attention to everything, which she respected. She had told Rokas on their 3rd Thursday that he was getting better at commenting on correct things. He had looked at her, then at me. You told her that, he said. I said, We tell each other things. He said, I see. He had, since then, made a point of commenting on things I had done correctly at least once every Thursday, which was so precisely calibrated to the minimum required that it was almost funny and also entirely genuine. I had told him so. He had looked fractionally pleased with himself, which was the Rokas version of satisfaction. Teal enrolled in the city's financial certification program. He did this in week 8, quietly, online, without mentioning it to anyone. He mentioned it at dinner 4 weeks later as if it were unremarkable. In the middle of a conversation about something else entirely, he said Times, the certification module on debt restructuring, was actually quite well designed. I was surprised Times, and then continued eating. Brandon said, Wait, you enrolled in the financial certification program? I said, In week 8. He said, And you're telling us now? I said, I just did. You didn't need to know before now. I was doing it independently, which was the point. Brandon looked at me. Then he looked at Rokas and Kester. He said, Is anyone else going to say anything? Kester said, It's a good program. Rigorous. Rokas said, The debt restructuring module is exceptionally well designed. The case studies in the 3rd unit are particularly... He stopped. He looked at me. Did you use the access code for the advanced materials? I said, Yes. You left it on your desk. I assumed it was available. He said, It is. I just want to know if you've already gotten to the 4th unit. I said, I finished the course 2 weeks ago. There was a brief silence. Brandon put his face in his hands. Then he looked up and his eyes were bright in a way that was very clearly not what he was claiming. He said, I'm fine. I'm perfectly fine. I'm not. He stopped. He stood up and came around the table and hugged me from behind, which was Brandon's version of a feeling that had exceeded the available options for expression. I sat in the hug and let it happen. Rokas said, from across the table, with the expression of someone who was not going to hug anyone but was feeling the equivalent internally, The advanced materials are yours, all of them. You don't need to ask. I said, I know, but I appreciate you saying it. The deed was framed in my mother's hallway. I had asked my sister to help her hang it in the week after the hearing. In the frame I had sent plain wood, nothing elaborate, the kind that let the document be what it was without dressing it up. My mother called me after she hung it. She said, "It's crooked." I said, "Have Mara fix it." She said, "Mara says it's level." I said, "Then it's level." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Teal. These men." I said, "Yes." She said, "Are you—" She stopped and started again. "Are you happy?" I thought about this seriously, the way I thought about things that deserved a serious answer. I said, "I'm building something I couldn't have built before. I think that's what happy is. I think the rest is just what it feels like from the inside." She was quiet. Then, "Your father would have liked them." I said, "I think he would have liked Brandon immediately and liked the other two after he'd spent time with them." She laughed. I said, "That's accurate and you know it." She said, "Yes, I know." The envelope lived in the drawer of the desk in the study. I had moved it there in week 3, from the nightstand, because the study had become the room where I spent the most time, and the desk drawer was the right place for something that needed to be accessible without being on display. I had read the documents many times, the deed, the trust, the handwritten page. I did not need to read them anymore. Not because I had forgotten them, because I had stopped needing the reminder of what they said. The door was open. I had chosen not to go through it. The choice was present in the room with me every day in 3 different people who had made sure it was a real choice before they asked for anything. I didn't need the documents to tell me what I already knew. But I kept them in the drawer anyway, because some things should be kept not because you need them, but because they are the record of the moment something became possible. On a Sunday evening in spring, 6 months to the week from the Tuesday the letter had arrived, I was in the kitchen making dinner when Rokas came in. He stood at the counter. He had the quality of a man who had decided to say something and was choosing the right moment. I waited. He said, "I want to say something." I turned from the stove. He looked at the counter, then at me. He said, "I calculated the arrangement as a strategy. That is true. I looked at the debt situation. I identified the Harwick risk. I saw the opportunity to resolve it in a way that served the Hale Group's interests as well as your family's. All of that is accurate." He paused. He said, "And then I met you, and it stopped being a calculation." He looked at me. "I don't know exactly when. I've been trying to identify the moment for 6 months. The kitchen reorganization. The day you came to the study about document 1 and told me the door couldn't work if I controlled what you knew, the garden. Week 3 when your suppressants slipped, and I sat in my study for an hour thinking about rain on warm stone." He looked at me steadily. He said, "I thought you should know that." I looked at him. I set down what I was holding. I said, "I know." He blinked. "You know?" I said, "You stopped presenting it as a strategy about 6 weeks in. You're not good at hiding the things that matter to you once they've started mattering. The newspaper, the flagging, the coffee in the morning." He looked at me. I said, "You're extremely good at precision. You are less good, once you care about something, at making it look like you don't." He was quiet for a moment. Then something in his face did the thing I had been waiting for. I had not known I was waiting for it until it happened, but I understood now. The precision let go. The management released. Underneath it was a person who was overwhelmed and certain and who had been building things carefully for 6 months and had arrived at a place he hadn't built toward but had arrived at anyway. I crossed the kitchen. He raised one hand and set it against my face carefully, the way he did everything. The way he had set 2 fingers against the back of my hand in the study and looked at me with the gray eyes that had registered everything for 6 months and now registered only this. I said, "The door opens from the inside." He said, "Yes, it does." He leaned down and I leaned up and we met in the middle, which was how it had been from the beginning, not one of us going to the other, but both of us arriving at the same place from our own directions. The kitchen smelled like dinner and coffee and spring coming through the window. In the living room, Kester and Brandon were doing whatever they were doing on a Sunday evening. In a few minutes, one of them would come through, and the moment would become a different kind of moment, one that included all 4 of us, which was the kind of moment this house had been building toward since October. I stayed in the kitchen a little longer. I looked at the counter, the crossword, ready for tomorrow morning, the corner where the bakery item appeared 2 or 3 times a week, the organization that had been correct since week 2 and had been adjusted twice since, once by me and once by Kester, both times in the same direction. I thought about a Tuesday evening in October and a letter on a kitchen table and 3 questions asked in a voice that was steadier than it needed to be. I thought about 21 days and clothes in the right size and an envelope presented by a man in a reception hall full of people who thought they knew what it contained. I thought about a document read into a public record in a flat professional voice. The door of this house opens from the inside. The silence that followed. I thought about choice, what it looked like when it was real, when the alternative was genuinely available and you chose anyway. Outside, spring was finishing what it had started. The garden would be green in a week. The rose hedge, which had been bare since October and patient all winter, was coming back. Some things wait for the right conditions. Then they choose.